Have you ever picked up a hitchhiker? My husband and I were leaving the grocery store and witnessed a big dramatic mulch theft. Yes. Someone grabbed a bag of mulch, tossed it in their Jeep and sped off. Tires squealing, jumping curbs, it was confusing and hilarious. The high school clerks were mostly indifferent, but there were a couple employees freaking out and running after the Jeep. Then we turn around and there is this girl standing there with her jaw hanging open and holding a box of donuts. She just looks at us and demands I need a ride. I don't know why he just did that. That's my cousin. The employees who were freaking out kind of turn and start coming toward her now that the Jeep is gone. So we were like, okay, let's go. She lived like 2 miles away in the mobile home park. Sure enough, the Jeep was parked in the drive. For some reason her cousin just totally ditched her for a $4 bag of mulch. I once picked up what I now know to be my uncle on a street. After some good conversation and a joint between us, we realized that we were family. Distant uncle then. Not so much now. That is the sweetest hitchhiker story I've ever heard. Major props to you and your determination to help this guy. I've picked up plenty of hitchhikers in my life. One I remember was a 28-ish-year-old guy who was trying to get to Madison to be a test subject for a new ADD medication. Apparently they lock you up for a couple months, regulate your diet and exercise, then give you a few grand and set you free. You know, if the meds they're testing don't heal you. Anyway, I got him another 50 miles down the road before I had to turn south. He was nice though. This past June, right before our wedding, my now ex-husband picked up 3 crusty kids and their dog. They were hitching their way to a rainbow gathering, so he brought them home to me. We fed them and packed them goodie bags full of aspirin and hand sanitizer, along with 10 pounds of dog food. Then drove them to the next state. They were a nice bunch of kids. I've also not picked up hitchhikers who I thought were suspect, but I usually go to the nearest gas station and put together a bag of water, Gatorade and granola bars and bring it to them. Even if I think they look creepy, I still don't want them to go hungry. I also had to hitchhike when I hit a deer in Jasper and was 200 miles from civilization. It was -30 out and I had no signal. Luckily a family stopped and drove me 200 miles to town. Otherwise I surely would have died overnight. The guy turned out to be a Mountie. When I was 12 or 13, my dad and I were on our way home from somewhere a few hours away and he decided it would be a good idea to pick up the hitchhiker on the side of the interstate holding a cardboard sign with the name of our town on it. As soon as we picked him up it was obvious that he was homeless. He smelled terribly and when asked him where he lived he asked just to be dropped off downtown. His name was Steps. He turned out to be very nice and down to earth. He told us about hitchhiking all over the country and what he had seen. Before we dropped him off we bought him some McDonald's and then never saw him again. My dad's first words when he got out of the car were, "Don't tell your mother about this." I was dropping a friend off at the airport, and some middle-aged guy with luggage came up to my car and asked for money for a taxi to where his hotel was. He kind of didn't know the city's geography, and a taxi would have cost around $80. He didn't look too happy when I told him that, and explained that he had just flown in from a job interview in Detroit, and was in town for another job interview the following day. After hemming and hawing, I let him jump in, and drove him the 40 miles to his hotel. He was apparently an engineer, who I kid you not, worked on rockets, the space shuttle, and other various flying things. He said he was on his last, and these job interviews were the last bit of hope for him. We just talked the whole time about his previous jobs, and various 3D rendering software technology. It was my first time picking up a hitchhiker, and he wasn't creepy at all. TLDR, picked up a hitchhiker. Didn't even get a handy. I picked a guy up one time who started out being friendly. He then made some joke about stabbing me with this strange laugh. Like it was a joke but not really. I told him to get out. I pick people up all the time. for some reason most Americans expect every stranger in the world to be a cold-blooded murderer. I've met some decent people this way. I live in Japan and I once picked up two guys hitchhiking. They had come from Okinawa, at the very southern end. Hitched all the way up to Hokkaido and were now hitching back. When I dropped them off they gave me a candy bar. And we posed for photos because they were collecting pictures of everyone who gave them lifts along the way. This was kinda a pay it forward thing for me. Because in Australia our Japanese exchange student got lost one time and some random guy picked him up and drove him to our house. Dropped him off and drove off again without ever saying anything. This kid spoke no English either. For the past year I've tried to pull over when I see someone buy a broken down car. I don't drive much, but I've probably pulled over about 15 times. This past summer I was on my way back to school and saw a guy who was sitting in his car on the side of the road, so I pull over to see if he needs any help. He was broken down, had no phone, and was 2 hours from his home, so I let him use my phone to call whoever he needed. I've always thought that I wouldn't pick up a hitchhiker because, well, I don't know what would happen. But after he got off the phone I asked if he needed anything else and he asked for a ride to the nearest gas station, 20 minutes away. I didn't even think about it and told him to get in the car. If I had thought before answering I doubt I would have offered, but I gave him a ride and no trouble came to me. I felt terrible for the guy. He was 25 and was already divorced and lived 3 hours from his kids. So every other weekend he drove 3 hours in his early 90s piece of shit car to see his kids. I knew he hated his life except for his kids. Good God, I could tell he loved his kids. I can only hope that someday I'm as loving of a father as he is. Thanks for what you did. A lady did the same for me and it meant a ton at the time. Still think about her a lot. She picked me up on one of the worst nights of my life. Also the night before my birthday. I was in bad shape in a different county and it was February. She even took me to her place. Fed me. Let me clean up. Gave me a jacket. And smoked me till way early in the morning. She was awesome. I was more afraid of her than she was of me, I think. Haha. I think you just have to be smart. She said I looked like I'd needed help and didn't seem like a threat, so she just picked me up. As often as I can. I work at a ski resort and pick up people hitching up the road a couple of times per week. Hitching karma is more useful than Reddit karma. Spoke with a tourist I met here in Australia. And he was telling me of two backpackers who decided to travel up north separately. But by hitchhiking. They would be picked up by random cars and trucks. And sometimes one would progress hundreds of kilometers ahead of the other. While at other times they discovered they were in the same town. There was even an instance where one had been given a ride in a semi-trailer. And found his friend walking along a remote highway. Reunited. I was in the car with my brother when we picked up a hitchhiker. His name was Cameron. Was trying to get to the local bus stop to get on a bus to see his girlfriend. I think he was 18 or so. No complications whatsoever. It was a 5-minute car ride. We just made some small talk. After we dropped him off, my brother said to him, "Have a nice life." I thought it was funny at the time. But then I realized that I was never going to see that guy in my life again. Which is still a ridiculous idea to me whenever I think of it. Sorry, mine isn't as interesting as some others. I picked up a guy down in Dayton and drove him 30 miles north. He smelled funny but was nice. He was telling me about this driver in Tennessee who purposely hit him with their car. He had a huge gash on his arm, it looked gnarly. As chance would have it, I had recently got a piercing, so I had a tube of Neosporin with me. It wasn't much, but I gave it to him when I dropped him off. I was a tad nervous picking up an older male hitchhiker since I am a female, and at the time I was maybe 19, but I am glad I did it. When I was younger my mom brought home 2 hitchhikers and they stayed with us for a few days, so maybe it's genetic. When I worked up in Yellowstone National Park, many of the other employees used hitchhiking as their main mode of transportation. I brought my truck up with me so I never had to stick my thumb out. But picked up those who did every chance I got. I picked up some guy by my school once who needed a ride to his apartment about 10-15 minutes away. Not really as cool a story as yours. But he needed to get back to his apartment because his brother's kids were being dropped off there by a bus and he would have missed them otherwise. He ended up talking to me about how DNA is like a programming language. I'm a software engineering major, and like all programming languages, someone needs to give it meaning for it to do anything. That's why he believed in God. Someone had to give DNA meaning, or else it wouldn't do anything at all. I thought it was a pretty interesting concept, though I still don't believe in God. I have given 2 different strangers rides. The first was a homeless man that had a bag full of empties and was trying to get to the store, but his bag ripped a mile from his destination. The second was a guy that tried to sell me some crack and pot outside a bar. I gave him a ride back to his house on the outskirts of town. I actually had really great conversations with both of these guys. Mostly about their criminal pasts and the downward cyclic spiral that the justice system forces them into. I'm going into forensics, so we actually had really constructive talks. First time I picked up hitchhikers was when I was in Banff on a course and decided to go skiing. I had reserved a small rental car, but ended up with a Dodge Charger that looked like a hearse. On my way back to town from the hill, I saw a couple of kids with snowboards and their gear, offered them a ride and they were dumbfounded, reading themselves to walk quite a ways carrying their boards. They told me that they always walk because nobody ever stops for them with their boards. By chance I had this massive rental car and lots of time to hill. The look of stunned appreciation from people not expecting a favor is awesome. I have a buddy who used to drive trucks across Texas. One day while leaving Austin, he picked up a little squirrely looking black dude who said he was going 90 miles north. About 5 minutes into the ride, the little squirrely guy goes, "You ever had a boy suck your big dick?" My buddy and I picked up a hitchhiker on the way back from White Sands Missile Range. We'd brought pizza for his co-workers who were on guard there. On the way back, this guy flags us down, tells us his car is busted. So we pick him up and drive him into town. That's when he tells us he left his wife and infant child in the car. Don and I look at each other, knowing this is a bad stretch of road. But we're in the wrong lane and we're too far to turn around anyway. We end up getting his tools, driving back, figuring out we can't get the car to go on its own. Don puts them up for a couple of days while their car gets fixed, because that's the hell of a guy that he is, and they get back on the road at that point. I think they were grad students at NMSU or something. One night I got off work pretty late, probably around midnight. I lived in a not great part of a not great town, but this area was commercial and not bad. I saw a waitress walking across the road, much older than me, and she looked so tired. I could totally empathize because I felt exactly that tired as well. So I rolled up to her and asked if she needed a ride. She briefly sized me up and got in. After we settled where she was headed, she told me, "You shouldn't pick up strangers." I replied to her, "You shouldn't take rides from them either." And that was all we said for the rest of the ride, probably 10-15 minutes. Yes. Terrible idea. I was driving back into town one day and see this car on the side of the road about 30 minutes out. A little bit later I see this guy in a business suit carrying a duffel bag. So I slowed down cause I figured I was close and it's just some dude whose car ran out of gas a little too soon. Anyway, I pull over. He throws his bag in the back of my car. And I'm like, "Hey, where you headed?" He just glares at me and says, "Just take me into town." So I was a little nervous and pretty annoyed. Then for some dumb reason I asked him what he had in the bag and he said, "None of your ducking business." So the whole rest of the drive I'm just thinking this can't be real. Thank God it was still light out. I was getting more and more nervous. We get into town. I stop at the first gas station cause I want him out of there as soon as possible at this point, and I drive away and make it home alive. Then later I go out to get my sheet out of my car and realize the guy left his ducking bag. I have picked up hitchhikers, but I'll add my sweet story about roadside assistance. Late one winter night, I decided to visit my mother. She was living in a pretty shitty neighborhood, having recently separated from my father. She lived on a dead end that the city didn't bother plowing much. I got down there, realized her car wasn't there, and tried to turn around to go home. I got really stuck. Young, female, alone at night in a shitty place. Out of nowhere, like 4 young black guys showed up, thug looking. They approached my car without saying anything, me feeling like a sitting duck. And then they just pushed me out. TLDR, stereotype blown. The only time was last year. I picked up a little old lady. She needed a ride to the hospital to see her son. She was ESL, and not that good at it. It wasn't far out of my way, and she was very thankful. My mom tells me of how her and her first husband picked up a hitchhiker. Everything went well. He got off at his destination or whatever, and they looked back where he was sitting and there was a huge knife. I've done over 60,000 miles on a thumb, and it's guys like you that keep me doing it. Things have gotten pretty bad for me on the road at times. Robbed once or twice. Police hassles. Sleeping out in bad weather, but every time I'm grumbling and cold and pissed and telling myself I'll never do it again. Some guys like you and your friends show up and renew my faith in humanity. Spend 3 days on foot. As soon as those brake lights spark up and that one decent human being pulls off to the shoulder, it's better than Christmas. Thank you just doesn't seem to cover it. May the road gods bless you. My friend. My friend and I saw a girl at a Greyhound station in Gainesville that's no longer there. She looked tired. Fresh off the bus and far enough from places friends were likely to live. We stopped. She got in, and as we started driving we asked where she was going and she asked where we were headed. We were off to the library, but she must have a destination. She asked about going to one of our places or perhaps a hotel. It took a couple more circles of questions before I realized she was working when we stopped. So we doubled back. Gave her $20 for taking her off the market for a few minutes, and let her get back to scoring tricks. TLDR. Picked up a hitchhiker who was actually a casually dressed prostitute. In my childhood, my dad and I were driving down the countryside of North Carolina, and a grown mother was walking down the road in what seemed to be the middle of nowhere. It was around 1 PM when we picked her up, and she had been walking since 8 AM with a large backpack. She was on her way to see her granddaughter. My dad told her she could have a ride, and we took her to her daughter's house. While speaking with her in the car, we also learned she was a Native American woman who grew up in the area. I once picked up a hitchhiker when I was 19. I was on a camping trip once and driving to my next location, which happened to be the Knock. He turned out to be a river guide, so we drove him to work, got out of the car, and went whitewater rafting. I've only picked up hitchhikers a few times. In theory I'd like to, but safety reasons and all. Anyway, the most recent hitchhiker I saw was this kind of biker type. Leather jacket, ponytail, tattoos, and a black eye patch. If you had to construct the most dangerous, untrustworthy looking hitchhiker possible, it would look a lot like that guy. I wanted to help him out, and I'm sure chances are he meant me no harm, but wow. I just kept going. I have picked up people in Ohio and Maine, USA, because I have lived in these places. I have never had any problems except the occasional body odor. One day I was driving to the next town over and a guy needed a ride the way I was going. Turns out he was going to court for charges that we didn't talk about, and on my return journey another gentleman needed a ride the other way. I didn't get much accomplished, but I felt that I took that ride for them. As an Ecuadorian American with dual citizenship in both countries, let me say thank you and mad respect for what you did. It takes a lot of trust to pick up a hitchhiker, let alone to get over the prejudice most Americans have and pick up a Latino hitchhiker. Man, I wish someone would pick me up and smoke me a spliff when I visit Ecuador. I've picked up dozens of hitchhikers. I've also hitchhiked extensively around New England and California and have had great times and met great people. I tried a cross-country trip from NY to CA but gave up in Florence, KY. Thousands of people just drove right past me. Duck Florence y'all. It was similar throughout Ohio. It really saddened me to see people being so selfish. I bought a Greyhound ticket not just because it was convenient but because it broke my heart to be treated like I was some sort of worthless piece of trash on the side of the road. In 1987 my sister accepted a ride from a man who instead took her off. Tortured her and then just basically hammered her face off. Turns out, the man had been questioned in at least 2 other murders as well. In the end, he took a plea bargain and served only 20 years. My mother attended every parole hearing and spoke on my sister's behalf. 6 months after his release in 2007, he stalked and terrorized my family. He even left packages in our driveway. One was my sister's shoe. Another was a pair of newer looking panties covered in blood. I will never get over this. This is the reality of what hitching rides has done to me. I don't give rides and I don't accept them. My car broke down once when I was 17 and I walked miles and miles away to pay phone, denying every offer. More recently, due to friend car troubles, I was prepared to stay overnight at a gas station before I would accept a ride from anyone. They had no cab service there to take us to a hotel. I saw a guy in LA who needed a ride out to my neck of the woods. I took him and had a nice chat with him. Turns out he wanted to go to local speedway to see the NASCAR race. He was dressed pretty nice. So I asked how he would pull it off. He said he would say he was the cousin to someone in so and so's pit crew and that his wife was in labor. He said it worked all the time. Heh. With over 2,000 replies I doubt this will be read. But hey. It's not me but my boyfriend's dad's story anyway. I'm not a very good storyteller but my BFF's dad. We'll call him Ace. Him and a friend were driving and some man was looking for a ride. Ace decides to give him a ride. After driving a bit, the man pulls a gun on them and demands money. The 2 friends somehow overpower the man and kick him out of the car. They then find a phone and call the police. So that's that. 3 years later Ace is driving and picks up a hitchhiker again. The man gets in and it's the guy who stuck him up. Ace freaks out. And the man calms him down. And thank him. He then tells him that when the police got him, he had to go to jail. Where he ended up kicking a pretty nasty heroin addiction. He has Ace to thank for his life turning around. And that. I've picked up a couple. One was a Gelatino ex-convict who was headed a few towns over to sell greeting cards. Another was a professional hobo who had been doing it since 1953 and talked a lot about how Batman was his favorite thing ever when he was younger.